Association of Northern Appalachia, West Virginia Writers, Wheeling Arts and Cultural Commission for sponsoring this event, and thank you all for coming today. So once again, I'm going to bring up the Poet Laureate of West Virginia to introduce our keynote address person today here. Here is Mark Carson.
Good afternoon. It is an honor to welcome Jennifer Haigh here to Wheeling in our celebration of Wheeling Reads. It truly is a very special treat and pleasure. Jennifer Haigh is the best-selling author of the short story collection News from Heaven and the highly acclaimed novels Mrs. Kimble, Baker Towers, The Condition, Faith, and Mercy Street, as well as, of course, the Wheeling Reads 2023 selection, Heat and Light, which was named a Best Book of 2016 by the New York Times, which called it a tour de force, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and NPR. Her books have won the PEN Hemingway Award, the Massachusetts Book Award, and the PEN New England Award in Fiction, and have been published in 18 languages. Jennifer is a Guggenheim Foundation Fellow and won a Literature Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. These are no small achievements. These are very impressive. She lives in New England. Let me also say here that Heat and Light is simply one hell of a novel and one possessing a resonance with our own place, this northern tier of Appalachia, that is unparalleled in my estimation. Certainly the backdrop of a community beset by fracking, the most recent exploitive industry, valuing profit over human lives, I found compelling and relevant and true. I'm not sure that a nonfiction book could provide any more clarity regarding the ins and outs of this industry than does this novel. You wed that to a cast of characters, each of which is carefully and convincingly created, and a web of plot lines that expertly draws them together, and you have a story that is as captivating and as pertinent as any you may read in a long, long time. Please welcome to Wheeling to cap off this year's Wheeling Reads celebrations, Jennifer Haigh.
Thank you, Mark, for that fantastic introduction. I am humbled. I cannot tell you how pleased I am to be here in Wheeling, West Virginia to talk about this book. Nothing in life makes me happier than hanging out in a library talking to readers. I grew up in a tiny little town that was 50 miles from a bad bookstore. So when I was a kid, the public library was the center of the world for me. Also, my mother was a high school librarian for 30 years, and since I was a little kid, she's been putting great books in my hands. That one factor has had such an enormous impact on my life. I'm not kidding. If my mother were not a librarian, I would probably be doing hair somewhere. So a shout out to any librarian who might be in this room. I think I speak for all writers when I say that we are just so grateful for the work you do. So when I learned 6 months ago that Heat and Light had been selected for Wheeling Reads, I was over the moon. This is a book that is very dear to me. It's a book about my home place, about our part of the world. Heat and Light has been published in France, in Germany, in Italy, in China. It's been read by people all over the world, but I don't think any of those readers understand it in the deep way that Wheeling, West Virginia can. You know, when I talk about this book, it's kind of a Rorschach test. I find that people's reactions to it depend to some extent on where they're from and what they have lived and observed. So if you're from Pennsylvania or Southern Ohio or West Virginia, you have a richer understanding of the people in this story than readers in, say, California, because you fully get the context. Heat and Light is, as you know, set in Bakerton, Pennsylvania. It's a place I've written about before, a place that looks like a lot of towns in West Virginia. It's an industrial town that has lost its industry. It's lost its reason for being. I know that place like the back of my hand because I grew up there. The Bakerton in my books isn't exactly the town I grew up in. It's sort of a composite of small towns in that part of Pennsylvania. These former company towns with names like Barnesboro and Patton and Clymer and Asheville. These former company towns that have been struggling to reinvent themselves since the local coal industry collapsed. The town I grew up in was called Barnesboro. I say was because it isn't there anymore. You can't find it on a map. When my mother and father were growing up there in the 40s, Barnesboro was a bustling little town of about 5,000 people. It had 2 movie theaters, 3 grocery stores, about a dozen churches, and at least that many bars. Both of my grandfathers and 6 of my uncles were coal miners, which is pretty typical. Every family in town had a father or a son or a husband or brother in the mines. But by the time I was a kid, in the 1980s, the churches and bars were still thriving, but the town itself was clearly in trouble. The mines were shutting down and laying off men by the hundreds. People were moving away in droves. Barnesboro was on its way to becoming a retirement community. People living on Social Security and pensions because nobody else could earn a living there. The town lost so much population that in 2000, they didn't have enough of a tax base to cover basic services, so the town council basically voted itself out of existence. They voted to merge with the town next door and give it a new name, Northern Cambria. It's the northernmost town in Cambria County, and if you Google Barnesboro, Pennsylvania, that's where Google will helpfully redirect you. Now that history is really important. It's partly why I feel so driven to write about this place, gone and nearly forgotten. I write to keep it alive. The town today is a shell of what it once was. Half the storefronts are boarded up. Even the churches have closed. The local Catholic diocese is short on priests, so they have, as they say, consolidated the parishes. When I was a kid there were all these lively ethnic parishes, the Irish church, the Italian church, the Polish church, all gone. Those buildings have been boarded up or torn down. The town's swimming pool, where I spent my entire childhood, has been filled in. There's no budget to maintain it. There is nothing whatsoever for teenagers and young people to do, and so, not coincidentally, the town has a raging drug problem, methamphetamines and opioids. Some smart writer, I think it was Faulkner, said that literature starts with a wound. In Faulkner's Mississippi, that wound was slavery and Jim Crow, all the consequences playing out generation after generation. In my books, the wound is the economic collapse of a community, which I trace over 3 books. The first one, Baker Towers, looks at Bakerton in its heyday, before World War I and after, World War II and after, that vibrant little town my parents grew up in and were so nostalgic about. That nostalgia was part of the reason I was driven to write my novel. I grew up hearing stories about what a great place the town used to be, how vibrant, how bustling, how alive. And it was kind of hard to believe, since, by the time I came along, that was all over. Baker Towers was my attempt at time travel. I wanted to go back in time and experience the town as my parents knew it, the way it once was. I wanted to see it for myself. Now, I've also written a bunch of short stories set in Bakerton. They're collected in my book, News from Heaven. But I always believed that Baker Towers would be my first and last Bakerton novel, for the simple reason that it didn't seem like anything else was ever going to happen in this town. After it was published, I thought, okay, I did it. I'm free now. I can write about something else. And I did. I wrote a couple of novels set in Boston, where I now live. And Bakerton as a subject just seemed completely exhausted. Like that town was just ready to to dry up and blow away, and there was nothing more to say about it. But I was wrong. When Marcellus shale drilling came to Pennsylvania, I knew I had to write about it. To me, it was an irresistible story. It was a surprise third act for this little town that truly was not expecting to have one. So Heat and Light really was a book I did not intend to write. When I first talked to my editor about it, I will admit he was not thrilled. I remember him saying, "You're going to write a whole book about fracking." Well, as all of you now know, it isn't a book about fracking. It's about people. It's about how being raised in a particular place shapes your outlook, your experiences, your choices, the opportunities you have in life. It affects the compromises we all make in exchange for a little economic security. And it also looks at the way relationships can change when there's money involved. Rich Devlin, the main character in the book, is a prison guard who hates his job. The only thing that keeps him going is his dream of becoming a dairy farmer, working his grandfather's land. Leasing his mineral rights is the only way he's ever going to have the money to go into business for himself. So he's not even worried about the environmental consequences. It's his wife who starts thinking about them. They've got this 7-year-old daughter who is constantly sick, and the doctors don't know why. And his wife believes it is connected to gas drilling. Rich's neighbor, Rena, down the road is an organic dairy farmer, so fracking is in fact ruining her business. She is the one who organizes the citizens group who meets at the public library. It's true, the most significant scene in this book happens in a library. So the community is suddenly divided by what some people think is a great opportunity and what other people think is a disaster in the making. For me as a writer, it was a great pleasure to be back in Bakerton to write about a place I understood so intimately. It really was like reconnecting with old friends. For example, Dick Devlin, who owns the commercial hotel in Heat and Light, appeared briefly in my other 2 Bakerton books. Unless you've read them very carefully, you wouldn't remember him, but he appears in both Baker Towers and in one of the stories in News from Heaven. Almost no readers will catch that, but I know what his past is. And so in a weird way, I feel bound by what I've already written. I've been writing about Bakerton for so long now that I've actually written multiple generations of some families. When I think of a new story from Bakerton with new characters, I immediately think about how they're connected to the Bakerton people I have already written. For instance, if I were to start a story right now and there was a character in her early 40s, I would think, what year did she graduate Bakerton High School? Was she in Darren's class? Or was she, no, she was younger, she was in Shelby's class. And so I have all of this in my head. All my fictional characters live in the same imaginary universe, and many of them know each other. So if I've written a character, I cannot ever unwrite him. Any future Bakerton story I think of exists in a world where this character is still living, whether or not he happens to be in that particular story. As I talk about this, this sounds demented, right? It's like this elaborate form of mental illness. But I'm telling you, I keep what I call a concordance. It is an alphabetical list of every Bakerton character I've ever written, even if he has only one line in one short story. He's on the list, first and last name, what year he was born, what year he graduated high school. Because in a small town, as some of you may understand, people do know each other. And if they don't know you, they know your family, they know your parents, they know your grandparents. The same is true with my Bakerton characters. They all know each other, or at least know of each other. So I kind of have to keep it all straight. For me, writing a novel is both a logical process and an intuitive process. There are these choices I make in a conscious way, and others I make subconsciously, these discoveries that happen in the process of writing. For instance, when I started writing Heat and Light, I knew that Dick Devlin's son Rich, the prison guard, would be central to the story. It wasn't until I was about 6 months into writing the book that I realized that Rich had a younger brother, Darren. This happens to me all the time. I set out thinking I know what the story is, and then I start writing, and the characters sort of take on their own life. And they have histories, they have relationships, they have siblings and cousins and people I haven't met yet. And in the process of writing the book, I meet them all. In writing the whole Darren story, I surprised myself. I did not set out to write a story about addiction. Darren's history, his opioid habit, his recovery, his work as an addictions counselor, all that took me by surprise. But if I stop and think about it, it made perfect intuitive sense that this is part of the story. My town, Bakerton, has always had a thriving bar culture. Drinking, sometimes problem drinking, is out in the open. Everybody does it. But the town also has developed this drug problem that nobody's really talking about. Like a lot of places, after the economy faltered, the mines closed, addiction became a very successful local industry, maybe the only one. When Dick Devlin was laid off from the mines, he opened his tavern. His son, Rich, works in a prison that is full of convicted drug offenders. And his younger son, Darren, is an addictions counselor. In effect, this whole Devlin family is in the addictions business. After I'd finished writing the first draft of the story, I understood why that piece of the story was in there, why that developed. Heat and Light is a book that deals with energy extraction. It's really about our addiction to fossil fuels. And what is addiction, really, except this compulsion to poison ourselves in the same way industry can poison the land? It's in there for a reason, and yet it wasn't a reason I could have told you in the first year of writing the book. I had to write the book to figure that out. Now, a novel for me starts with the moment after which nothing will ever be the same. In the case of Heat and Light, that's the arrival of Bobby Frame, the landman, who goes door to door buying up people's mineral rights. So I thought I would read to you a bit from early in the book. So if you haven't read the book or haven't finished it, this isn't going to give away very much since it happens right at the beginning. You can follow along if you like, but you will see that I skip around some. I often do this when I do readings, so I don't read sections that require too much explanation. So you may find that I'm jumping around a bit. The first truck comes in springtime, a brand new Dodge Ram with Texas plates. It trawls the township roads north of Bakerton, country lanes paved with red dog, pie crust roads that have never appeared on a map. The roads dip and weave for inscrutable reasons, disused mine trails, scarred and narrowed like the arteries of the very old. The driver, Bobby Frame, is as young as he looks, barely 30, a big husky kid who might have played high school football. Up and down the Dutch Road, he is welcomed warmly at the Feddersons, the Nortons, the Kiplers, Marlis Beals. "Are you some kind of salesman?" he is asked at Friendly Acres, the Mackey dairy farm. "No, ma'am, just the opposite," Bobby says. At Cobb Krug's trailer, his first knock goes unanswered. When he knocks a second time, Cobb rolls to the door in his wheelchair, brandishing a shotgun. Bobby never returns. He bunks at the Days Inn on Colonel Drake Highway, room 211, the windows east-facing, for an early start. Mornings, he appears at the county courthouse as soon as it opens, clean-shaven, hair damp from his shower. He has a way with the clerk, a middle-aged lady who mothers and flatters him. Bobby hands her a printed list and waits for her to bring the books, the official record of who owns what. His approach is always the same. "Beautiful property you've got here," he says, this while removing his sunglasses, his eyes level blue and earnest in the morning glare. Except for Cobb Krug, folks listen as a matter of courtesy after he shows his business card and explains why he came. His explanation takes 2 minutes exactly. The shale lies a mile underground, has lain there since before there was a Pennsylvania, before a single human being walked the earth. Older than coal, older even than these mountains. It has an imperial name, the Marcellus. Deep in the bedrock of Saxon County, a sea of riches is waiting to be tapped. Natural gas? The words repeated with some hesitation, the first lesson in a foreign language, vowels and consonants in odd permutations, awkward in the mouth. Those who know the local lore make immediate connections. There is a mountain spring, secret but famous, that bubbles for no reason. In the woods north of Deer Run, at a spot called the Huffs, heady vapors seep through the rocks. The huffs are popular for underage drinking. Teenagers pretend to, or perhaps really do, get high on the fumes. Buried treasure, says Bobby, feeling the poetry. The Marcellus Shale is nature's safe deposit box, its treasures locked away like insurance for the future. Now, at last, American ingenuity has found the key. We drill a half-mile down, then we turn a bit sideways. You can drill for miles like that right under your property. We're so far down there you never know we're there. You want to buy my land? The farmers ask, gobsmacked, as though Bobby has demanded a lung or a kidney, a piece of themselves God can't replace. Not buy, just lease it. You can keep on farming it like usual. You get a bonus up front, 25. Later, 100, 500, 1,000, an acre. Once we start drilling, you get 1%. Again and again, the same response, what do I have to do? Reminding him always that they are farmers, lives of servitude, unrelenting effort. There's nothing to do, says Bobby with a grandson's smile. Sign the papers and wait for the check. Rural Pennsylvania doesn't fascinate the world, not generally. But cyclically, periodically, its innards are of interest. Bore it, strip it, set it on fire, a burnt offering to the collective need. Bakerton understands this in its bones, a town named for a mining company, Baker Brothers, and not the other way around. Chester and Elias Baker threw the first shovel, bought up the farmland and hired the men, Poles, Italians, Hungarians, Croats, who arrived in large numbers by wagon or train. The men slept in camps and later, company houses. Their wives washed black coveralls and had babies, bought groceries with company scrip. The babies grew up, worked, married, were drafted. The lucky ones came back to mine coal. Union wages meant Fords and Chryslers, split-level houses. On Susquehanna Avenue, shops opened. The new public high school had an Olympic-sized swimming pool. When the mines failed, the reverse happened, like a film run backward. 4 sale signs dotted the avenues. One by one, the storefronts went dark. The miners, too, were extinguished, black lung or heart attacks or simple old age. Never mind now, they're all equally dead. The children and grandchildren moved away, forgot everything. Only the widows remain. They will, if asked, point out the old mine roads, the clearings where Tipples once stood. Baker 1, Baker 4, Baker 7, Baker 12. This past holds no interest for Bobby Frame, though he owes his success to it. The distant memory of boom times, the ghost of prosperity that lingers in the town. Here, grand promises are met without skepticism. The landowners are churchgoers, people of faith. The agnostics, there are a few, need only look to history. Bakerton has been favored before, tapped by industry's magic wand. He lives a nomad's life, which is not for everyone. 4 shale plays in 6 years, Barnett, Haynesville, Fayetteville, Marcellus. He's a star at the company, Dark Elephant Energy. Twice a year they fly him back to Houston and turn him loose at a training seminar. This could be you someday, the new recruits are called, and take notes. If he's made sacrifices along the way, girlfriends who sent him packing, the college degree he didn't finish and now doesn't need. If he missed his high school reunion, family birthdays and holidays, weddings and funerals of people he loves. If regret can singe him without warning, as he lies awake listening to motel noises, distant televisions, the ice machine down the hall. If all these things, so be it. In daylight, the phantoms dissipate. He appears at the courthouse at 8:30 promptly, his mind clear for the mission. Beautiful property you got here. The new recruits take notes. This Monday morning, a trainee shadows him. Bobby's had trainees before and appreciates the company. They roll along number 9 road, an old mining trail, and onto the Dutch road, past Jim Norton's pine forest. Carl Neugebauer's southern pasture sits at the top of the hill. Bobby signed both properties last week. With Kipler to the east, that's 600 acres altogether, he tells the trainee. Wow, that's amazing. The kid studies the topo map spread across his lap and locates each property with his finger. Kipler, Norton, and Neugebauer? Well, what's in between, though? It's a big one. Parcel 112? There is an awkward silence. That's Mackie. Dairy farmers. They need some time to think it over. Bobby keeps his eyes on the road. Both times Mrs. Mackie saw him coming and met him on the front porch. He hasn't, so far, made it into the house. Quickly, he changes the subject. Richard Devlin Jr. owns 60 acres. By all appearances, he's just sitting on them. Bobby drives slowly along the southern edge of the property. There is a newish suburban-type ranch house, prefab from the looks of it, and behind it, a patch of neatly mown grass. Beyond lie acres of deciduous forest, a creek in need of dredging, a sloping pasture overrun with kudzu. They pull into the gravel driveway. Up close, the house looks naked, not a shrub or a tree around it, as though it dropped out of the sky. No porch, not even a sidewalk, just a single-story cracker box wrapped in aluminum siding. Bobby knocks and waits. He hears voices inside, television noises. The door is opened by a young wife in a pink quilted bathrobe. Can I help you? She looks younger than Bobby, older than the trainee, but just barely. Blonde hair in a ponytail, glasses sliding down her nose. Ms. Devlin? Bobby introduces himself and the kid, whom he calls my associate. Sorry to bother you so early. In fact, it's already 10 in the morning, the sun blazing overhead. Mrs. Devlin doesn't keep farmer's hours. She squints in the bright light. Oh, that's all right. Come on in. The room is sparsely furnished in a way Bobby has seen before, the peculiar poverty of couples with young children. There is a couch, a giant television, and not much else. In one corner sits a plastic laundry basket filled with plastic toys. Mrs. Devlin leads them into the kitchen, sunny and airless, smelling of breakfast. Toast crumbs on the counter, greasy dishes in the sink. At the table, a girl child, 3 or 4 years old, eats saltines off a plastic plate. I stayed home from school, she announces. Bobby sits beside her. Though it's already late August, the vinyl tablecloth is seasonal for Independence Day, with a stars and stripes motif. You look too little for school, he tells her. The child takes umbrage. I'm in kindergarten, she slurs like a tiny belligerent alcoholic. She's small for her age. Is it just me or is it cold in the house? Mrs. Devlin hugs the bathrobe around her. It's pleasant, says Bobby, who's already sweating through his shirt. Without asking, she pours them both glasses of orange juice. Rich worked a double. He should be back any time now. Where does he work? Bobby asks, drinking gratefully. Out the prison. Mrs. Devlin frowns as though wondering for the first time what these strangers are doing in her house. I thought you were friends of his. Her bathrobe is floor-length, bulky as a down comforter. Beneath it, presumably, she has a body. Bobby thinks of women in Arab countries, draped head to toe in cloth. No, ma'am, though I look forward to meeting him. Your neighbor Carl Neugebauer thought Rich would be interested in doing some business. He launches into his pitch then, though it's a clear waste of effort. He'll have to rewind the whole thing when the husband gets home. When he finishes, Mrs. Devlin looks flabbergasted. On our land? Are you sure? Beneath the robe, she could be anorexic or 6-month pregnant, a mermaid, or a double amputee. Yes, ma'am. The geologists have already mapped out the whole area. We'd have to do some additional testing, of course, find the best spot to drill. At last, he hears an engine in the distance, a scattering of gravel. A moment later, a screen door slams. Bobby gets to his feet just as Rich Devlin charges into the kitchen. He's Bobby's size, a big blonde man in a green uniform. His eyes go from Bobby to the kid, his wife in her bathrobe. Who the hell are you? Beautiful property you got here, Bobby says. All right. So that is the moment after which nothing will ever be the same. For the characters in this book, leasing your mineral rights or deciding not to is a moment of, it's a pivoting moment for them. When I'm writing a novel, I am fascinated by how a single event can have repercussions that can really move the whole story along. In this case, a single corporate decision, like sending a drill rig to Western Pennsylvania, can completely transform the lives of all these people. I mean, one of the characters, as you know, is a female minister who has a storefront church She's trying to do some outreach to the guys on the gas rig, and she ends up falling in love with one of them, not knowing that he's got a wife and kids back in Texas. So all these consequences that spool out from this initial event of sending the landman to Pennsylvania. When I'm writing a novel, I don't really think about plot. I'm really thinking about causality, how a single event like that has consequences that lead to more consequences that lead to more consequences. When I'm writing, I never know where that chain of causality is going to lead. Basically, I write the book so I can find out what happens to the characters. I believe that writers and readers are the same in this respect. We're driven by the same basic curiosity. We all just want to know what happens next. So, causality. The arrival of Bobby Frame is a game changer for Bakerton, which, like a lot of small towns, is a pretty insular place. It isn't the sort of place people move to. If you live there, you were either born there, and probably your parents were too, and just couldn't figure out a way to get out. Fracking brings a sudden influx of new people, the kind of people who've never been seen before in Bakerton. First the landmen, then the drilling crews from Texas or Oklahoma, these guys who spend 6 months or a year living in a motel room or some kind of temporary housing built by the company. That man camp I write about in the book, I found that so interesting. You know, half the town of Bakerton is living in houses that used to be company houses, built by the coal companies. These drill rig workers are also living in company housing. It just looks different. And the arrival of all these new people changes the town. In a way, it's a novelist's dream. In Heat and Light, you get to see the consequences unspool and unspool. For Dick Devlin, for instance, gas drilling is really good for business. He doesn't really like these guys who come to drink in his bar, but they're really good for business. Rena, the organic dairy farmer who's opposed to fracking, develops a mad crush on the environmental activist Lauren Trexler, who comes to town. That dynamic was so interesting to me. These environmental activists who come to a place like Bakerton with all the best intentions, but are really outsiders. They don't really understand the communities they're trying to help. As I was writing Heat and Light, I was watching the whole fracking drama play out simultaneously in Pennsylvania and in New York State. And the story turned out very differently. Pennsylvania and West Virginia, welcomed the gas industry with open arms, more or less. But in New York, there was a very well-organized campaign to educate voters about the environmental risks of fracking, the risks of groundwater contamination, what happens to the landscape and the general quality of life, the noise, the influx of heavy equipment, the truck traffic. You know, the activists talked about these towns in Oklahoma that never had an earthquake until they started fracking, and now have 100 microquakes a year. The goal in New York State was to ban fracking completely. And guess what? It worked. The state completely outlawed fracking in 2014, and that ban remains in place to this day. 9 years later, it's possible. But interestingly, those environmental arguments that were so effective in New York State really didn't get any traction in Pennsylvania, or for that matter, in West Virginia. There were people who cared and tried to get involved, but it didn't really move the conversation. And as I was writing Heat and Light, I gave a lot of thought to why that was. Why was it so different? And my theory is that Pennsylvania, like West Virginia, has always been an energy state. I mean, not many people know this, but in fact, the first oil well in the world was drilled in western Pennsylvania. The 3 Mile Island nuclear disaster happened in Pennsylvania. Coal companies have been running roughshod over that state for 150 years. There's been strip mining, there's been longwall mining. And all that history matters. To me, it explains why communities in Pennsylvania and in West Virginia have been much more tolerant of some of the environmental consequences of fracking. In our region, prosperity has always come with a side order of environmental destruction. It just has. And so to a lot of people, it seems almost inevitable. people see it as a binary choice, that a community can either be clean and destitute or prosperous and contaminated. It's one or the other. Now, this way of thinking to a lot of environmental activists is complete nonsense. But to a lot of people I grew up with in Pennsylvania, and I think a lot of voters in West Virginia, it has a certain kind of logic, because historically, it has always been true. Hence this kind of greater, this higher threshold people have, this willingness to tolerate. Those complexities are what Heat and Light is all about. Like a lot of writers, I write to understand the world, the contradictions and controversies I can't make sense of in any other way. When Heat and Light was first published, I did a bunch of readings and events in Boston, where I live. And of course, there's no shale gas in Massachusetts, and most people there had never given much thought to fracking until they read my book. What little they did know came from the documentary Gaslands, which is about people in eastern Pennsylvania whose water supply has been contaminated by fracking. So naturally, if that's all you know about fracking, the whole thing is kind of a head scratcher. I mean, to readers in Boston, it was inconceivable that any state would allow this to be done, that any community would tolerate this. And yet, at the same time, I was doing readings and events in Pennsylvania and meeting readers there, and those conversations were entirely different. I met people who had leased their mineral rights and felt it was the opportunity of a lifetime. One of these people was the mother of an old high school friend of mine. She and her siblings had inherited a family farm that was no longer being farmed. And in her words, the land was just sitting there. So they leased the mineral rights because from their perspective, the land wasn't being used. And if they had an opportunity to make a little money off it, at least to cover the taxes every year, well, why not? Why wouldn't you? I think if you're from an energy state, you may think of land more as a resource, a thing to be used for commercial benefit rather than something simply to be preserved. And that's the disconnect that happened in places like Pennsylvania between the people who lived there and the environmental activists who came to try to persuade them to say no to fracking. Loren Trexler, the character in Heat and Light, is a college professor. He's highly educated, he's politically sophisticated, and he is totally mystified by people in Bakerton. He just can't see that for working people with no economic security, his kind of idealism seems like a luxury they cannot afford. For me, writing novels and reading them is an exercise in extreme empathy. It remains the best technology we have to get inside somebody else's heart and mind, to see the world through the eyes of someone who is completely unlike us. I spent 5 years writing Heat and Light. I talked to farmers, geologists, a prison guard, a minister, a county sheriff. I talked to environmental activists and a bunch of guys who work on drill rigs. I also talked to people who own land in Pennsylvania, some of whom have leased their mineral rights and some who refuse to. I did not talk to politicians. I wanted to hear from the people who were directly and personally affected by gas drilling, which is why when I got around to writing, I found myself telling the story from so many different points of view. I lost track of how many there are. I think there are 10 or 11 points of view in the story. There's the farmer, the environmental activist, the CEO of the company that's doing the drilling, the guy who works on the drill rig. In my opinion, there was no other way to do it accurately and fairly. To get the full picture, you had to see it through many different sets of eyes. For me as a writer, it was in every way a lesson in empathy. And while I have my own opinions about fracking, and I firmly disagreed with some of the characters in the book, I realized that when I was writing from their point of view, I had to take their side. At least for the time when I was writing that character, I had to believe as they believed and side with them completely, even knowing that a month from now, I'm going to be writing a character who believes the exact opposite. You know, it's kind of like being an actor. As an actor, you don't pass judgment on the character you're playing, you become the character you're playing. So you have a real allegiance, a loyalty to the character you're playing. And the same is true for a fiction writer writing in a point of view. For the time I'm writing Kip the Whip or Rich Devlin, I see the world as they see the world. I learned a lot from this exercise. I did learn that there were no villains in this story, that even the people with whom I disagreed completely had compelling reasons for believing what they believed and doing what they did. Heat and Light was published in 2016, and it's been a real pleasure to revisit it. In thinking about what I wanted to say to all of you today, I found myself wondering, if I were writing Heat and Light today, would I write it any differently? I mean, a lot has changed in the past 7 years. Our country has been through so much, socially, politically, ideologically, and not just our country, the entire world. You know, I got married this summer, and we went to Ireland on our honeymoon. We flew out of Washington, D.C., and when we were coming back, as we were landing at the airport, it was just about the scariest landing I had ever experienced because of the smoke. From 10,000 feet in the air, it looked like North America had completely disappeared. Now, the last time I checked, which is like a couple weeks ago, the wildfires in Canada this summer had burned 54,000 square miles. That's an area the size of New York State. It is staggering, the devastation, the droughts, the fires, year after year. When you think about it that way, it's astounding that we think about anything else besides what is happening to our planet. Personally, I find myself thinking about the climate more and differently than I did when I was writing Heat and Light. It's all just happening so fast. The immediate consequences of fracking, the contaminated drinking water, even those earthquakes in Oklahoma, are the least of it. It's nothing compared to what nature has in store for us with the warming of the oceans. And yet, all these years later, we are still hooked on coal and gas and oil. We keep on extracting and burning fossil fuels because it's extremely profitable for a few companies, and because we've been slow in figuring out better alternatives. Many states, including West Virginia, continue to elect politicians who are climate change deniers. I'm looking at you, Joe Manchin. These guys are so heavily subsidized by coal and gas and oil companies that they can't acknowledge what's happening right in front of us, what we can see with our own eyes. No matter how bad the fires get, the heat and the floods and the droughts and the hurricanes, these guys are going to continue to pee on us and tell us it's raining. They are denying the evidence we can all now see on a daily basis with our own eyes. So in a way, Heat and Light is even more relevant than when I wrote it, because it shows in human terms exactly what the obstacles are. Like the characters in the book, we're all just taking care of our own backyards, our pocketbooks, trying to feed our families, take care of our kids. We're all busy just being people. And many of us still haven't really noticed that the forests are burning and the water is beginning to rise. So thank you for listening, Wheeling. Thank you for reading this book and hearing what it has to say and bringing your own unique experiences and insights to the story. You've been an incredible audience. I am so grateful. Thank you. I'm being called out.
We have questions.
Oh, yes, please. Anybody have a question?
I'll start with a question.
Yeah.
In my view, one of the most impressive things about your writing is how you get the little things right. It's so good. And so I just want to know, you said you talked to drillers and men who worked on them, but how did the man room you referenced and then, the 3 Mile Island stuff, how did you get that
The male stuff. Well,
It's really good.
thank you. I'm glad to hear that. You know, I approach writing male characters exactly the way I approach writing female characters. I think we're more alike than different. The differences matter. They're important. But if you're going to make a pie chart of us as human beings, you know, the differences between men and women, I think, are a comparatively narrow segment of it. So I think it helps to begin with the assumption that men are comprehensible to me, that they're not some alien species that I'm not qualified to write about. Because you know what? I know a lot of men. You know, I have a father and a brother and a husband now, and you know, we all breathe the same air. So I start with the assumption that it is possible, and I listen to people, and I think that's probably my greatest talent as a writer. Before I ever wrote fiction, I collected oral histories. When I graduated college, I had a Fulbright scholarship in France, and I was collecting stories of people who'd fought in the resistance. And it was an astonishing experience. I was very young. I didn't really know what I was doing. But it taught me to listen in an entirely different way. And I think that is the best training in the world for a novelist. In doing the research for the book, and especially talking to the guys who work in the gas industry, I realized how powerful that is. Because, you know, if you work on a drill rig, no one ever asks about your work. Like, if you say I work on a drill rig, there are not going to be any follow-up questions. That's kind of end of conversation. And I talked to some of these guys who work in the industry, and I found they were very happy to talk about the work they did. They were proud of what they did. They were really interested in equipment and talking about different kinds of equipment, and rarely had anybody ask them to elaborate on these points, and I did. I had one guy tell me, I've been married for 30 years, and my wife never asked me this stuff, which I believe. So I think it is, you know, it's the same kind of empathy, whether you're writing men or women. It's the same kind of deep listening you have to do justice to any human being. And it's also not talking too much, listening more than you talk. So, true story, in the summer of 2015, I spent a little time in the Wheeling area. I was collecting some oral histories with a couple named Carrie and Michael Klein, whom some of you might know. They are radio producers who until recently lived in Elkins, West Virginia, and they were interested in the subject of gas fracking. So we spent some weeks going around talking to people, not really in Wheeling, but sort of in the outlying country, who had been directly affected by fracking, and asked them how it had affected their lives. This couple, Carrie and Michael Klein, were some of the best teachers I've ever encountered. They had a very unusual way of approaching an interview. The goal, they said, was to just ask one question. And if you ask the right question, you'll just get your subject talking, and they'll tell you what they want you to know versus what you think you want to know. And that was a revolutionary idea to me, because I've always over-prepared for interviews. I ask a zillion questions. And I realized, well, then I'm just getting the answers I'm looking for because I'm the one framing the questions. And so if you shut up and let the person you're talking to actually express himself, you'll get to know what he thinks is important versus what you assume is important. And that was wonderful training that I used all the time in doing research to write this book. The question is a great one. It doesn't always work, but it almost always works. The question Carrie and Michael Klein use is, tell me about your people and how you were raised. Just that one question. And if you're really good, somebody could talk for 2 hours about that. And, you know, it's permissible to nod or to repeat the last sentence the person said, just to like prime the pump a little bit. But you do very little prodding. It's really just sitting back and listening in a deep way. And it dramatically changed the way I approach doing research and doing interviews. Yeah.
One of the things I really enjoyed about your novel is that all the characters, regardless of how sympathetic or unsympathetic they may be, but one thing that really ties them together beyond even the environmental concerns, right? How that is all of them are searching for or trying to maintain a sense of dignity. You mentioned these oil workers, for example, you talking to them and they just open up, which you wouldn't really expect. You expect them to be suspicious. to speak a sense of pride in what they do. That's a universal thing I think all people want to have. In your estimation, both in a novel and just in real life in general, how much is that pursuit of dignity both a means of overcoming these problems and an obstacle to actually solve these problems from mental or otherwise?
Oh, that's a great question, and one I have not been asked before. Thank you for that. Okay, so we were talking about the importance for all the characters in this book to maintain a sense of dignity. And the question was, to what degree is the desire to maintain that sense of dignity a help in overcoming some of these problems, and to what degree is it an obstacle? And I do believe it is both. I do think that pride can lead people to make really self-destructive choices sometimes. I've done it myself. So it's both. It's both at the same time. Yeah. Yes?
I feel like maybe you get this question a lot. You've written one other book, Mercy Street, since Heat and Light.
Yeah.
That was very good. I loved it. But are you going to go back to Bakerton?
To Bakerton. You know what? I do get that question. And I always say no, and I'm always wrong. So don't listen to me. What do I know? I'm wrong every time I answer that question. I always feel, when I finish writing about that place, heartbroken and exhausted and like I can't do it again. But then always something happens that draws me back to that subject. And it's because I do have deep feeling for that landscape and those people. You know, those are my people, and that is how I was raised. And you don't ever, you don't lose that. And as a writer, it's what you have to work with. It's like there are certain stories you have to go looking for as a writer, and then there are other stories that are just given to you. And for me, the given stories were anything related to Bakerton. Like my relationship to that place has been a real gift to my work as a writer. When I was growing up there, I really thought I must have done something terrible in a past life to have been born in this godforsaken place. It really felt like a misfortune at the time because the town was really falling apart when I was a teenager. And it wasn't until years later when I started writing fiction that I became so grateful for the experience of having grown up in that place, because it really, it gave me so many gifts. It helped me understand the way people are interconnected. And of course people are interconnected everywhere, but in small towns the connective tissue is much more obvious. So it certainly informs my worldview, and I think I could write 20 books set about that place if it didn't break my heart. It's not that there's a dearth of material, you know, it's just that it's kind of painful.
Can I interrupt just for a second? We're going to go over time, which means the library's going to close upstairs. But we'll have staff at the 16th Street door and at the elevator up here, meaning that is fire escape door, to let you out so the staff upstairs can go home. But I don't want to rush this, so don't feel like you have to rush, but let's keep that in mind.
You're a doll.
Sorry.
Oh, I just have a follow-up question to that. Do you feel that because, and we've talked about this just a little, that you were maybe felt like a little bit of an outsider in your community, that is what gave you the ability to write about them? Like, if you felt fully immersed in this community, would it have been different?
Are you kidding me?
God, you just the door exterminating.
It sounds like a door.
Yeah. Is it locking up?
Yes. So back to Christina's question about feeling like an outsider. I think when I was very young, I wanted desperately to be an outsider, actually. You know, part of growing up in a very small town is that it is suffocating in a way. That everybody knows everything about you. Everybody knows everything about your family. It's, you know, being an outsider was sort of impossible. And yet later, when I truly was an outsider, I wanted to write about the inside of it. So I think if I had continued to live in that community, I would have been unable to write about it. I don't think it would have been possible for me. Maybe some writers can do that, but I did need to get some distance from it in order to see it clearly. Yes?
I appreciate what you said about being always trying to take the character's perspective. And I wonder if you had any certain tricks you resort to when you were doing that. When you're really immersed in writing from a perspective that is not yours, but where you were directing your empathy and worldview.
You know what I find incredibly effective to feel compassion for anybody is to write about them as a small child. Because every one of these characters was once a small child. And however they are as adults, they didn't start out that way. And so you start to think about, how did this man or woman become the person they became? Well, you start with their childhood. You write about their parents. You write their earliest memories. And I think that's a wonderful technique for finding compassion within ourselves, whether you're a writer or not. You know, when you are confronted with a person you find infuriating and incomprehensible, try to imagine that person as a child and work forward from that. And it's powerful.
I want to thank you for your book. The opening scenes, I experienced them personally. Somebody came to my door with a card and started to talk to me, and I said, "You can go away now." It doesn't matter how much you're offering. I mean, I didn't even get that far. He said, "I understand, okay." But that whole experience of my neighbors saying, "Well, they're going to drill underneath you anyway," which can't be true. Is it true?
It is true in some places. It absolutely is. It depends on local ordinances, but yes.
But if I have my mineral rights, they're going against the law then.
The law varies in different communities, and it's called forced pooling. And in some communities, they, in fact, are allowed to drill under your property as long as they are below a certain depth.
Well, I've got a crack in my kitchen wall, so maybe that's part of it.
Yes?
I like the statement that you made that there were no villains in your novel, and I know myself. Do you see that as a relevant experience and perspective that we need to be more cultivating in our culture? That we tend to put people into those spaces of, she's the hero, they're the villain, they're the villain, that we don't see the whole.
You know, I absolutely think we can benefit from that. To see people in a nuanced way in the public sphere is getting harder and harder for all kinds of reasons. The deep divisions in our society, the kind of polarization we're all seeing, it's getting harder and harder. I think literature is a great way to build that muscle, that empathy muscle. You know, the difference between what I consider real literature and novels that are just for entertainment really has to do with that question of moral complexity. I think in real literature, there are never people who are simply villains. There are people who do terrible things, who have evil qualities, but they're always more complex than that. When I teach creative writing, I always tell my students, people are more than one thing. All people are more than one thing. And you cannot write a creditable character who is only one thing. Certainly you see that in some kinds of genre fiction, in some kinds of thrillers and horror and romance novels, and even some not very good YA novels. There is this kind of oversimplification, this moral simplicity, where you're either wearing the white hat or the black hat, and there's nothing in the middle. And literature recognizes that everything is in the middle, actually, that there are no true villains or true heroes. And so reading really good literature reminds you of that constantly.
Do you think that writing a novel is, in a way, an advantage to getting at the truth than just, straight good journalist reporting?
I absolutely believe that. novels can do things that journalism can't do. And I have immense respect for journalists, and I read a lot of journalism, but what novels can do is work the magic of point of view. And that's what we've been talking about, this seeing a situation through somebody's eyes, through the filter of that person, as she has become since childhood. You cannot do that in journalism. You have to write the story from the outside. You cannot write people's interior weather.
It's more flesh to this.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
So first, I'm just appreciative that your book exists in the world. I think many of us in this room, I've grown up and most people sort of have around resource extraction, first coal, now oil and gas. So thank you for putting the book into the world for millions of readers. You touched upon this a little bit earlier, but I wanted to come back to reactions of different audiences. Because I'm so interested when you have talked about this book to audiences who more have lived this versus audiences, like you mentioned audiences in Boston. Wait, what? Because something that struck me when the floods happened in Eastern Kentucky in 2022 is how empowered people from areas that have not grown up, like have not experienced coal and things felt to say, well, this is because y'all vote a certain way, or this is because y'all, and it just struck me as, wow, that is a really, wow, because it's not so simple. The things that are happening with the climate aren't just because in West Virginia or Eastern Kentucky, we've allowed resource extraction to happen, or we voted a certain way or not, and that's a complex, everybody's not voting just one way in any of these areas. And it just struck me as a little bit of advocating yourself. If you live in an area where there's not resource extraction, that doesn't mean you're not benefiting from it.
Oh, you turn on the lights every day. Yes.
So I'm curious, just to go a little deeper into the reactions, because there's a bit of a call to action in your book, and you said at the end of this that you should really think about what is happening and that we're still ignoring it as humans. So if you just talk a little bit more about the reactions across different audiences.
Well, it is very much related to this earlier point that has to do with being able to see the perspective of somebody unlike yourself. This political moment we live in where things are so polarized and so angry on all sides that there is a tendency on all sides to demonize people who don't vote the way you do, who don't think the way you do. And we can see where that's getting us. That's getting us nowhere fast. But I have experienced the same thing you have, that this idea that Appalachia is responsible for all its own problems, and it completely ignores the very real fact that all the energy extraction that happens in Appalachia benefits everybody. And so there are all kinds of people in this country who don't have to live with fracking or longwall mining and still get to turn their lights on every day. And so, it's a convenient way of looking at it. It's a way of feeling clean and like you're not implicated in what is happening. So, yeah, and it happens on all sides. I mean, all political persuasions. Anyone else? All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming. If any of you want your book signed, let's do that, and then we'll get out of here.
Really fascinating process. They were briefly touched upon the characters, keeping them straight in that year, right? Because to me, the characters are overwhelming, but they're very distinct. So I really like learning more about your process. Very interesting. And you do that all the time. I do.
Yes.